Okay, brilliant. So next up on the floor is James Faulconbridge, who is a professor in the Department of the Organisation of Work and Technology in the Management School at Lancaster University, and is also one of CeMoRe's longest-serving associate directors. From 2014 to 2019, James worked alongside other colleagues from Lancaster in the Demand Centre, a large RC UK-funded project investigating the interconnections between energy, mobilities, and demand. His mobilities-related publications include an edited collection which arose from CeMoRe's 10th anniversary conference. Wow, 10 years on. Traces of the Mobile Field, 10 years of mobilities research. So I would really like to welcome James to the floor. Thank you very much indeed.
See if I can find the slides.
James, they're kind of ready to go.
Oh,
just find them for you.
Okay.
Yeah, I just oh, no, they've moved. I had them ready, but they've moved. I've just got to find my documents. Documents gone. That, yeah, it's actually been called my documents. There, it's gone up there. Okay, I'll just go put in colloquium a minute.
Wow, there's a quick search. I'm going to do something quite different, but that's typical CeMoRe, I think, actually, that there are no strict parameters about how you do this. We didn't get a kind of you must do X or Y, there's all very much, but make it up. But I think what I'm going to do, I think, is explain why I think CeMoRe and mobilities research can do exactly what Monica described, that ability to think differently, think big, think creatively. So rather than talk about my research, I'm going to talk about my involvement in CeMoRe and what CeMoRe's been for the last 20 or so years that I think kind of facilitates the kind of creativity and the innovation. And as was alluded to there, probably many times today we're going to ask each other how many years have you either been at Lancaster or how many years you've been involved in CeMoRe, and then it starts to get a bit scary for some of us. So 20 years old, I did a quick calculation, it's 18 years that I've been involved in CeMoRe. It was March 2005, and Colin, who's sitting there, is responsible for that. Just before I came to Lancaster in May 2005 as a lecturer, and Colin asked me to come and talk at the CeMoRe Research Day in March, I think it was, of that year. Can't find the exact date, but I think it was about March. It wasn't too dark in Lancaster, so it definitely wasn't January or February. And what I want to talk about is kind of the 20 years between, well, 18 years between then and now, but some key moments along the way, but also what I think they represent about CeMoRe that I think is really important and that I think will mean it will have a future of 20 years or more. And as Lynn has alluded to, there's kind of plans in the making around that. So this research day, you can kind of imagine someone about to take their first job after their PhD as a lecturer being asked to come and do a talk at a research centre on mobilities when I was trained as a geographer, as an economic geographer, and I didn't really think I did mobilities, and so I was a bit mystified, but I thought, okay, we'll give this a go. And then, of course, you turn up and you come and sit down, and then you realise John Urry's sitting there at the front, and you think, oh dear, this is not good, because this is a bit scary. But that day, I think, and those research days for those people that kind of participated, I think capture everything that has been the foundation for the success of CeMoRe, in the sense of an openness, a kind of openness to inquiry and to be inquisitive, but also an inclusiveness in that mobilities permeates all aspects of life, and everybody, actually most people, have something to say about mobilities, and a willingness to bring that into the conversation and to use it to frame research. And that was very much my kind of first experience of the centre, but also, I hadn't realised it at the time, but probably the first experience of this field of mobilities research as it's come to be. So I'd read John's work. I'd, like Monica, used sociology beyond societies to inform my thinking, but hadn't quite realised that what I was doing was mobilities research at that point. So that was kind of, let's say, 18 years ago. That's scary. Over the next kind of few years while I was at Lancaster, and kind of as the conversations developed, my research in particular then started to focus around issues around I suppose you could kind of say the economic geography of mobility. I was very much still thinking of myself as a geographer at that point, and it led to two pieces of work, both of which John was heavily involved in. So we had a European Science Foundation grant on the future of business mobilities, which sounds kind of obvious now, but this was, I think there was probably just about Skype at this point we kind of used. This was kind of, again, and like Monica trying to think about the kind of after the Anthropocene, this was about thinking about what kind of comes next in a way that was trying to kind of, I suppose in a very pertinent kind of way, move us beyond the idea of us all traveling. So this was again the thing about a centre on mobilities. It didn't have to be about mobility as we intuitively thought about physically moving around. There were so many other dimensions, virtual, digital, mobilities of people in embodied form was only one kind of dimension. And of course, this was really kind of informed by the kind of theoretical work going on at the time to think about how mobility took many forms. That kind of happened at a similar time to an edited book that came out around Delete Mobilities, which I had a chapter in. But both of these kind of pieces of work that were important to me, but again, I think were kind of symbolic of everything about CeMoRe, about it being interdisciplinary, open, and thinking of mobilities from multiple perspectives and angles. And I'm not sure you can quite see it, but that edited book on elite mobilities was edited by Thomas and Javier, both who are here now. Thomas is in Australia, Javier, I'm not sure where he is, mobile somewhere as always, Javier. But there's something symbolic about this, about the fact there was many people involved in that project, and John was key in leading that, but actually it was about how the centre was developing and the next generation of researchers that were coming through, that they edited the book and they took the project forward. And so I kind of see this as being, as I described, the kind of foundation for an approach that allows the kind of exciting work, the kind of innovation Monica was describing. Now, if you're really brave and you've been here for a while, you can look at that Flickr link. You can just Google, if you just Google actually CeMoRe 10th anniversary, you can get to it. But there's lots of photos of the hotel over there, of the 10th anniversary conference. And the only one I put up was the one of me because I didn't want to offend anybody, because we all look a bit younger for those of us. It was 10 years ago, which is hard to believe for those of us that were there, I think. But I think this was the moment when all of that thinking, all of that curation that had been happening really came to bear, in the sense of both the diversity of the conference, but the true international reach of the conference and the ability to have global conversations in a very local Lancaster in many ways. And the fact, I don't think there are many centres that can organise a conference in Lancaster and actually have to turn people away because the hotel couldn't physically handle more people. And of course, this was before we could do anything online, so it was turn up or you can't participate. But again, I think that event embodied this kind of spirit of kind of going beyond the orthodoxy and thinking of mobilities in multiple perspectives, but in a way that challenged thinking and sought, like Monica's example of societal readiness, to kind of reset the conversation in new directions. I'm getting to a more meaningful point, I promise, eventually. It was mentioned that I was an associate director. I'm not sure I like the idea. Once you're longest serving, then you know you're in trouble. And Lynn mentioned this in the introduction, what we did after the conference was we were lucky enough to be able to set up the visiting fellowship scheme. And I kind of, for my sins, kind of sort of had responsibility, but I didn't really have responsibility. I just organised the files and then we all looked at them and decided who we'd like to invite. But the point was, I think this, again, then really showed how the centre had moved on and how mobilities research had started to emerge as this truly international, global, whichever word you want to use, phenomena. And also, though, how mobilities research is only successful when it involves collaboration, partnership, and working across the discipline. So what we were able to do through that fellowship scheme was invite people from all different parts of the world. I think we had people from Australia, from Europe, from the UK, to come to Lancaster and spend some time here, but from a whole variety of different disciplines, again, transport research, sociology, anthropology, science and technology studies, etc., etc. And at that point in time, and this was again mentioned, I think in the introduction, we were reflecting on what had actually happened, and we published, well, it's one thing really, but it took on two forms. So myself and Alison Hoy, who's not here today, unfortunately, but is still in sociology. We first published a special issue of Mobilities that took some of the papers from that conference, but then kind of did some updating as well. It came out, I think, about 2 or 3 years later. And as well as illustrating all of the things I've talked about, what we did there was reflect on this idea that what we now had was what we called Traces of a Mobile Field. And it was then republished as an edited book a couple of years after that. And in that, and this is the main significant point I'm finally going to make, in that we reflected on what a field is and asked questions about what a field is and asked whether CeMoRe fitted with any of those definitions, and then what that told us about what CeMoRe and mobilities more generally was. And I'm going to come to that in a minute. Since then, the centre has developed and the latest themes are here. But I think what all this illustrates, and when I took it to my final and ultimate point that's slightly more significant about a field, all of this was built around a number of things. And of course, one of them was a person. But it was about the culture and the spirit that I think John kind of set that has allowed all of these things to happen. It's about how you approach research. It's how you approach collaboration. It's how you develop the next generation of researchers and how you do that in an open and an inclusive fashion, but whilst challenging, asking challenging questions and the orthodoxy. As I say, for someone who's just finished their PhD, starting a new job, to turn up and have to do a talk and have to sit next to John Orrie, but it wasn't scary actually afterwards. It was at the time. But I think all of the events, all of the things that CeMoRe have done, that spirit has infused them, and it's allowed some of the kind of innovation and exciting work such as that Monica was describing. But I think it goes beyond Lancaster. I think it actually informs the culture of mobilities research as a field, as being open, inquisitive, and constructive in its engagement. And hopefully we're going to see that today, and hopefully we'll see that this afternoon in the early career sessions. But that was something that Alison and I reflected upon as we talked about these traces of a mobile field, but also how it's never static. And I think that the directors over time take a lot of responsibility for this in a positive way. So John originally, but then Monica, as we've heard, then Nick, and most recently Lynn, who's brought us all here together. It hasn't stayed still. Those most recent themes are quite different probably to the themes that first emerged around the centre. And I think this is indicative of how everything that's happened has formed this mobile field that we wrote about in the special issue and book, which I went back to and looked at what we said. So this was 10 years ago nearly that we were kind of thinking about this. And I remember conversations, Alison and I kind of debating, first of all, which theory of fields might we use, and we never resolved that one. So we decided we'd just have a look across a variety of different kind of scholars from Bourdieu through to others who use field. And we settled on 3 things that actually suggested mobilities research wasn't a field. So we found that, okay, this doesn't work anymore. Because fields are meant to have rules of the game. They're also meant to have distinctive identities, and actually in many ways they're seen as being exclusive. And we kind of saw the opposite in mobilities research when we were looking at it. We saw that actually there are shared interests, but there are no real strong rules of the game about how you do research and what research should be. There is an identity, but it's not a distinctive in the sense of different to others. It's a much more inclusive identity that means many things to many people. And as a field, it interacts with other fields in all kinds of ways, and there aren't strong boundaries. It's not about exclusivity and saying, so we were thinking at the time, should we be almost setting out here that there's a new field and here it is, and look, it's outcompeting another field kind of thing. And the world's changed and everybody should recognize mobilities as the big dominant field, and we couldn't see that. So we just called it traces of a mobile field. So when we weren't sure at that point, is this because it's still emergent? Is this because it's still developing? We couldn't decide on that. Looking back, I think what we have is still the same characteristics for mobilities research. But I think actually in many ways, what it is a field that's a sustainable field and a continually morphing field, and therefore a field that actually is probably more powerful than those that have fixed rules, clear, distinct identities, and are exclusive, because it allows creativity, it allows those that diversity of conversation in a way that perhaps when you have a much more bounded field is perhaps not quite so possible and easy. And I think the centre reflects that. And actually, I now think, if I were to write this again, I I would probably think about how this is actually the basis for a sustainable field, because it's a field that evolves, it's a field that flexes, and therefore is unlikely to kind of go out of fashion, is unlikely to kind of be made redundant as times move on. And I think that's what the centre's done. It's a very different centre to what it was 20 years ago. It'll be different again in 5 years, I think. But I think it's based upon that culture that was set, that approach to research that was set. And I think that's what we'll see today, and that's what you always see when you come to a mobilities event, is that diversity. So that's quite a different reflection to Monica's, but I think it's a reflection on the thing, as it were, and how it informs that research that we're all able to do, and all come from totally different places. And if I was to stand up and say what I'm doing now, the research is very different to what Monica's doing. But hopefully it still fits in the field. Maybe it doesn't. Maybe you'll tell me, oh, you're mistaken, you should be somewhere else. But I think it does, and I think it's because of those characteristics. And that, for me, is what that 20 years at the centre kind of means and represents. So I'll stop there. Okay.
Thanks very much to James for that, and it was just really fascinating for me to see how, you know, your trajectory and how you've kind of really got us to think about the sort of the interesting developments of mobilities, and is it indeed a field is quite interesting. From my point of view, the whole idea of interdisciplinarity and how it's been mobilities as a theory has been able to allow all sorts of disciplines to speak to each other in kind of really new and interesting ways. I think you've really expressed that really well, James. So that's great stuff.